Thank you very much. My name is Jim Jardine. I'm a member of the UCAP board. It's my privilege to introduce our next speaker, Ernie Allen. It's really an honor to have Ernie with us. He has a tremendous history. He's from Louisville, Kentucky, and became involved in really the creation. I think he's the father of the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children. Through his initiative, the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children was formed, and he served as the president and CEO of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children for 30 years. He recently retired, and shortly after he was retired, Prime Minister David Cameron of the United Kingdom called him and asked him to be involved in a commission Prime Minister Cameron's trying to establish worldwide on protecting children. And so he is an international expert. He consults and works with the Vatican and other governments. He's worked with other governments in trying to fight this terrible evil of child exploitation. And so it's really I have had a chance to visit with Ernie and just feel his commitment and his warmth, and we're thrilled to have him here with us today in our conference. So Ernie, it's yours.
Thank you, Jim. I'm honored to be here. I'm a great admirer of UCAP and the leadership of Utah in this issue generally. This morning, all of us were inspired by Elder Holland, and we experienced the positive, the hopeful message in the last session from Deanna. My message, I fear, is going to be a little more stark and a little more challenging, because I submit to you that by and large, for all the progress we've made, America is failing in its response to pornography. My friend, perhaps the world's leading researcher in the whole area of child exploitation, Dr. Michael Cito of Canada, says that we are in the midst of the single largest unregulated social experiment in human history. And what he is referring to is the bombardment of younger and younger children with graphic, extreme pornographic images via the internet. And the implication of that message from Dr. Cito is that we are already paying a price within society for it, and we're going to pay a greater price in the future. Now, Jim mentioned I served long time ago in public life in my hometown of Louisville, Kentucky. I was the director of public health and safety, responsible for police and fire and EMS, but also regulation of a variety of things, including adult entertainment. Well, 30 years ago, we could zone it off. We could strictly deny access to this kind of content by children. In this era of the internet, we can't do that anymore. And so the challenges are enormous. And so what I would like to do with you this morning for just a few minutes is to talk about four things. One is what we know about the problem, and we know more today than we ever have before. Secondly, how the challenge has changed. Many people who are concerned about pornography don't understand that it's a fundamentally different content, fundamentally different problem today than it was even 5 years ago. Thirdly, I want to talk about, and this is a little risky, particularly in a community like this where you've demonstrated such leadership and made such a difference in this area, I want to talk about how we have failed. And I submit to you that we have failed as a nation, and there's much more to do. And finally, I want to talk to you about a possible replicable model. As Jim mentioned, the British Prime Minister David Cameron asked me to chair a global campaign called We Protect, that is focusing on the victimization of children online sexual exploitation. But a part of Prime Minister Cameron's effort is to address the inundation of young children with internet pornography. So he has implemented steps like default filtering on the part of British ISPs. They're moving toward an age verification system. So I want to talk a little bit about that. It's not an answer to the broader problem, but I submit to you it is something that is doable that is achievable, and I think we can build a broad-based coalition around. So let me start with, what do we know? Well, the London School of Economics reported that the average age of first exposure to internet pornography is 11. And that is now a 10-year-old report. I believe that number is declining. It's continuing to get lower. They also indicate that 80% of 15 to 17-year-olds are accessing hardcore pornography online, and that 90% of 8 to 16-year-olds have viewed porn online. The Journal for Adolescent Health reported that now 85% of adolescent males and 50% of adolescent females are being exposed to pornographic material. This is a significant social challenge. As Dr. Cito says, the largest unregulated experiment in history. So what are the impacts? What do we know about the impacts of this problem? Well, the first and greatest concern is we know that the exposure of this kind of content to young children at a time in which their brains are just developing can produce neurobiological changes in the human brain. This is affecting what children view as normal. This is affecting what children view as appropriate relationships and how they interact with other people. Just last week, a prominent Stanford psychologist, Dr. Philip Zimbardo, wrote in Psychology Today that teens and preteens with highly plastic brains are today compulsively using high-speed internet pornography. And Dr. Zimbardo suggests that is changing the brains of young children at a time when they should not be encountering this kind of content. Child Abuse Review reported that particularly among boys, exposure of this kind of content at a tender age intensifies attitudes supportive of sexual coercion. And the journal Aggressive Behavior reported that exposure of this kind of content to 10 to 15-year-olds makes them 6.5 times more likely to report aggressive behavior and 24 times more likely to report sexually aggressive behavior. Younger and younger children exposed at a tender age to this kind of content are attempting to act out these acts that they see via the internet in the physical world. A good friend and a prominent forensic pediatrician, Dr. Sharon Cooper of the University of North Carolina, reports that mirror neurons in the brain make children who see this content think that it is real and think that they are actually experiencing the content when they see it. So the potential harm is enormous. Let me talk about the word addiction. The elder mentioned the use of the word addiction, and there is some controversy about addiction in this area. He also mentioned the extraordinary neurosurgeon, Dr. Donald Hilton, in Texas, who has done amazing work in this area. Dr. Hilton says that the exposure to pornography among the young creates an extension of what he calls reward-based learning. Children largely mirror what they see. They learn through imitation. And what happens is that this reward-based learning creates an environment in which they want to see more and more extreme and newer content in order to replicate it. He contends, and others have contended, that this is the whole basis of the concept of physical and psychological behavioral addiction. The Max Planck Institute in Germany recently issued a report that said that exposure of this content to young children produces decreased gray matter in the brain. and it's creating decreased gray matter in the areas of the brain associated with reward sensitivity. Therefore, there are strong arguments that it is in fact addictive. In the same way that reward response reaction, in the same way that drugs are physically addictive, and there are other kinds of behavioral addictions, ranging from the internet to sex to food, and pornography is similarly addictive. And let me mention one other thing that's come out of the recent literature about the long-term effects, the harm that's done by exposure of this content to younger and younger children. In the late 1940s, the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University produced a study, very controversial study, about the sexual activities and behaviors of modern people. One of the things that Kinsey reported in 1948 is that the incidence of erectile dysfunction among 15 to 30-year-olds was less than 1%. New research conducted with young military males found that erectile dysfunction is up now to roughly 1 in 3. And that is largely because of the inundation of this kind of content. So I'm a lawyer, not a researcher, not a scientist. There's a lot of research out there. It's a growing body of research. But I submit to you that it is ultimately and unambiguously clear that the exposure of this kind of content to young children is producing harm, is changing their brains, is changing what they view as normal and acceptable behavior, and that we are paying a price as a society for it. So let me move to my second point. And that second point is the challenge we face has fundamentally changed, and it's changed in a short time. First of all, the content has changed. So-called soft porn has disappeared, and it has been replaced by content that is extreme, that is graphic, that is degrading, and that is dehumanizing, particularly to girls. And as a result of that, there is a whole new model for pornography in which the pornographer is using techniques to help make the viewer feel like they are a part of the activity. They are in the scene. There's something called point of view photography that makes the individual who is looking at the content feel like he's a part of it. And what that does is to make the impacts of the pornography even more insidious than it has been before. Dr. Anna Bridges, I'm sure many of you have heard of the study she did a few years ago for the journal Violence Against Women. She took leading pornography scenes on the internet today, in videos and on the internet today, and she evaluated those scenes in terms of the extent of physical aggression. Modern pornography does not depict acts of love, acts of kindness. It depicts acts of aggression, acts of violence. And what Dr. Bridges found in reviewing all of these scenes with a number of colleagues is that 88.2% of the scenes included content which depicted physical aggression of one party against the other. 50% of the scenes depicted verbal aggression, name-calling, degrading terms, dehumanizing the recipient of the aggression. And 94% of the target of that aggression were girls and women. This is one of the reasons why we have an extraordinary opportunity today. We have the opportunity to build a far broader coalition to address this issue than ever before. It is no longer just a family values issue. It's a feminist issue. It's an issue across the social spectrum. The other thing that's changed that makes this issue more difficult to grapple with today than ever before is the pornography industry has changed its business model. they have moved to a business model that is based upon free porn websites. To give you an example, New York Magazine reported a couple of years ago that 10 years ago, the estimate is there were 1 million unique visitors to all pornography sites on the internet every day. 1 million visitors a day. They now report 42 million unique visitors every day just to the so-called porn tube sites, the pornography equivalent of YouTube, where you can go and access videos and watch this content for free. Now, how is giving it away for free, showing this content for free, a part of a business model? Well, the premise of the business model is that people who access this content and see an image or a video today are not going to be satisfied by that content tomorrow. So they're going to come back and they're going to see something new, something more extreme, something different. And at some point in this progression, it ceases to be free and becomes commercially viable for the industry. Now, who do you think the principal targets of these free porn sites are? They're kids. They're first-time users, first-time accessors of porn. So the whole business model of the industry has now shifted to a focus on kids, because kids represent potential long-term customers. There's another element that's changed and made it more difficult. And I'm sure many of you, for years and years, told parents, put the PC in the family room or the living room so that mom and dad can monitor the child's internet use and keep them from getting into trouble. Good advice. Pretty irrelevant advice today, however, because today kids are carrying the internet around in their hands. And you heard this morning from Pamela, 250 million users, mobile users, accessing porn by 2017. Let me add another element to this. Cisco recently released a report that estimates that mobile use will increase 11-fold by the year 2018, less than 2 years away. Who are the primary users of mobile technology in the world today? They're kids. They're young people. So I submit that that's another significant challenge. And let me add one other challenge that makes it even more complicated. Several years ago, the U.S. government, in its infinite wisdom, in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, developed a tool called Tor, which basically enables users to access and utilize the internet anonymously. It was done in order to protect political dissidents and journalists from retaliation by repressive regimes. A high-minded, noble purpose, noble goal. But guess what? Political dissidents and journalists are not the ones using these tools today. They're being used by drug dealers, weapons merchants, human traffickers, terrorists, and they're used by those who prey upon children, including pornographers. A UK university, Portsmouth University, recently reported that just 2% of users in now what's called the dark web, the anonymous internet, just 2% of the sites are pedophilia sites. But those sites account for 80% of the traffic in the dark web. So this is where this problem is migrating. The software is free. Anybody can use it, and we're in the midst of a massive debate in this country and the world today about privacy versus anonymity. And I've been going around the world arguing that while I, as well, I'm sure most of you, fervently support individual privacy rights, absolute internet anonymity is a prescription for disaster and will be used by all of those we're most concerned about. So, I submit to you that the challenges we face are greater than they've ever been before, and the need for action is greater than it's ever been before. So my third point, I submit to you that we have failed as a nation and as a society to address this issue for several basic reasons. And let me say in advance, some extraordinary work has been done in Utah and in other states and other communities across this country. However, our laws have failed. Congress passed 3 statutes to try to address this problem in the 1990s. The Communications Decency Act, the Child Online Protection Act, or COPA, and the Children's Internet Protection Act, or CIPA. The courts have struck down large portions of all 3 of those bills as violating free speech in the Constitution. So existing legal protections are minimal. 2, and like you, I was inspired by the earlier presentation by Deanna about what parents can do and need to do and should do. And there have been extraordinary efforts underway for many years by nonprofit organizations, by internet companies, by other companies that have developed tools to help parents keep this content away from their children. But Cox Communications just released a survey that found just 28% of U.S. parents use filtering and blocking softwares that are available to keep this content away from their kids. And that number drops to 17% on mobile devices. And it drops to 15% on gaming devices and consoles, which are online and which are where a lot of our kids are accessing this stuff. So we need to do all that. We need to talk to our kids. We need to use the available tools and softwares. Some of the companies that are here today have extraordinary tools that can be used. But I think we have to draw the conclusion after 20 years of trying that most parents are simply not going to do it. They know less about the internet than their kids. They don't know what their kids are accessing and seeing. And so the challenge is, how do we go beyond that? There's another reason why we failed as a nation, and that is that America has, by and large, and there are exceptions, but by and large has stopped prosecuting obscenity. Obscenity is a crime. There is a standard. All sexually oriented content is not legal and can be dealt with by police and prosecutors. In 1973, the Supreme Court of the United States laid down a 3-part test in a case called Miller versus California. One part of that test is that in order to meet the standard of obscenity, the content must violate contemporary community standards. Whose community? In this era of the internet, whose standards? The 1973 test may not be all that relevant to what we face today. An article in the Columbia Law Review said that there is material that was suppressed a few decades ago and that would offend every community that is now available on the internet in vast quantities. That's the challenge. So what do? I submit to you that we can demonstrate that younger and younger kids are being inundated with content that is causing significant harm to their brains, to what they view as normal, to how they interact in society. I'm absolutely convinced, I can't prove it scientifically, but I'm absolutely convinced that this is one of the contributors to the epidemic of sexual assault on college campuses in this country. We know that it's causing significant harm. We know that the challenges are greater and that the tools we used 20 years ago are either not being used or are not adequate to the challenges we face today. So what can we do about it? And I want to be as positive as Deanna was, and as uplifting and inspiring and hopeful as Elder Holland was. And there is a model that I want to spend a few minutes talking to you about. Jim mentioned that I'm doing work now as the chairman of We Protect campaign that was launched by the British Prime Minister David Cameron. There's an extraordinary speech I would urge all of you to read, that you can, if you Google David Cameron Child Protection, July 2013. Prime Minister Cameron talked about these issues. And what he said was, this is difficult for politicians to talk about. He talked about what a wonderful resource the internet is. And he said, I'm not doing this as a politician. I'm doing this as a dad. He has a 10-year-old, a 7-year-old, and a 4-year-old at home. And what he did was he called together the major British internet companies. And he said, here's what I would like for you to do. I would like for you to create default filtering for all content, adult-oriented content. Not doing this as a limitation on free speech. If the recipient, if the user wants to access it, he can opt to have the filter taken down. But he wanted all the internet companies to automatically filter the content, not depend upon individual families to make that decision. The Prime Minister said, I want you to do this voluntarily, but if you don't, the British Parliament will enact a law that imposes it. So this gave these companies the ability and the flexibility to develop it in their own way. In January 2015, Sky Broadband implemented default filtering for all 5.3 million users of Sky. And British Telecom and TalkTalk and Virgin Media responded as well. The industry also funded a massive education campaign for parents and families called Internet Matters. The Prime Minister's initiative is called Active Choice. And recipients, and it's filtered at the network level. So every device on the account is filtered. So not just the PC at home so that the 10-year-old with the cell phone can access it, but all devices on the account. Now, more people, candidly, more people have opted out of this than we anticipated. And my sense is it's not just based on pornography, but it's based on this sense that nobody wants government agencies to tell them what they can look at and what they can't. Nonetheless, Sky Broadband, 70% of Sky users have left those filters in place. And just 30% of Sky users have young children in their homes. So the assumption, and we can't yet prove it empirically, but the assumption is that those who are parents and have kids are using the UK filters. Now the UK government, I'm not suggesting this is easy. The UK government asked if I would host a meeting with a group of the major US internet companies. Prime Minister Cameron said, it's great that the UK companies are doing this, but he recognized that the capital of the internet is the United States. And we're not going to have the kind of impact that this could have if we don't get US companies to participate. So the Prime Minister sent a government minister over to Washington, and I hosted and chaired a meeting with a number of the major companies, and we presented the Cameron Initiative. And you'll be shocked to hear there was not much enthusiasm for it. These companies see this as a threat to their vision of a free, unfettered internet. And again, my argument is, I want the internet to be as free and unfettered as possible, but there need to be limits. And one of those limits is this kind of content should not be accessible by 10-year-olds or 12-year-olds or 15-year-olds. So the Prime Minister has launched a new initiative now that's not yet in place that I think is doable in this country, and that concept is age verification. So the British government is developing a program that will require every website, every pornographic website, not just physically located in the UK, but websites that are accessed by citizens of the UK, to implement an age verification system. So if these websites allow access to kids under the age of 18, they will be subject to sanctions and fines and other penalties. Now, I've had conversations with members of Congress about this, and one of the issues some years ago, we worked with a number of state attorneys general, including your then Attorney General Mark Shurtleff, on an effort to try to do age verification for access to social media. Younger and younger kids were getting on social media. And ultimately that effort failed because how do you determine in a valid way that a kid is just 12 or 13 years old? They don't have credit cards. They're not registered to vote. They don't have a driver's license. And so one member of Congress suggested that introduce me to a CEO of a company here in the United States, which is doing age verification for online gambling sites. And the question I asked that CEO was, how do we determine that a potential user is just 12 or 13 or 15? And his response was, we don't need to do that. We just need to prove that they're not 18. And so the British government is now moving forward on age verification for these sites. I think we can do that here. I don't know why the internet industry would have a problem with that here regarding internet pornography. They don't with online gambling. And there's another challenge that the British government is grappling with. And that challenge is the whole question of what you do about the free sites. What the UK is doing is they've brought together the finance, the payment companies, the credit cards, the other financial companies, and they've built them into this process so that if a company's collecting money and they refuse to implement age verification, the UK will simply shut down their methods of payment. So there's a real incentive to do the right thing. But what about the free sites? Well, the encouraging thing is that Pornhub, which is the world's largest free internet site, has committed to the British government that it will participate and that it will install and implement age verification on its site. So I know this doesn't solve the whole problem. I know that the larger issue of pornography is massive, but I think David Cameron has offered us a way forward. And what he said in his speech was, we've talked about this a lot, but we need action now. We need political leaders who will step forward and apply some of these things so that we can at least address the issue of young children being accessed and damaged by this account. And I also believe that we have an opportunity to build a broad-based coalition. I mentioned earlier the interest of the feminist groups. Naomi Wolf, a feminist leader, said that pornography has supplanted the need for real women. She said that today in much of this country, real women are just bad porn. That's just not acceptable. It's time to change that. So we need action at the state level. And, you know, the senator's efforts, I'm pointing at where the senator was, in Utah, I think are a great model for the rest of the nation. And hopefully we can take that to 49 other states. We need action at the federal level. When I've talked about these things to federal officials and to internet companies, they invoke free speech. And my argument is free speech is not absolute. Jim, who's one of Utah's most prominent lawyers, knows that 100 years ago, Supreme Court of the United States, in a case called Schenck versus the United States, said that free speech is not absolute. It is limited when there is a clear and present danger that the exercise of that free speech will cause harm to someone else. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes used the example of shouting fire in a crowded theater. I submit that pornography inundating the brains of young children is the equivalent of shouting fire in a crowded theater, and that we have to educate and take action to send the message that speech is not unlimited, that privacy is not unlimited. We want it to be as close to unlimited as possible, but there are appropriate limits that have to be imposed. And then finally, we need private sector leadership. These companies have done an extraordinary job of internet safety education and advocating the use of these tools, but it's not working. And I think there are specific actions that the Utah Coalition Against Pornography and Utah leaders can take to once again lead the nation on these issues. So that's my message. I'd be happy to respond to any questions. We have a few minutes if anybody has a question or comment. Yes, ma'am.
Are neurological changes to the brain reversible?
I think it's a difficult question to answer simply. What I understand from the child psychiatry professionals and the psychologists with whom I've dealt is that yes, I keep hitting my head on this, that there are positive steps that can be made, but most of the kids who are seeing this content are not getting interventions until far later. So like so many other things, if the intervention is early and timely, I think there are very positive things. And we're very much in support of a lot of what you're going to hear today about interventions at all levels. So yes, it's important. Yes, it works. The concern is when it starts young, it in many ways rewires the brain. And redoing that is hard. But it can be done. And again, I'm a lawyer, not a medical professional, so there are far better people able to answer that. But there's progress being made, but it's a challenge. Yes, sir.
So there's 250 million users, I guess, on just mobile devices, and there's only 3,000 people here. How do we grow to actually make a difference?
Well, the question was there are 250, there are 250 million, 250 million people accessing porn on mobile devices, and there are only 3,000 people here today. How do you make a difference? Well, I've always believed an old corny story. For 100 years, I've had a starfish on my desk. You've all heard the story about the starfish and the child running, but they've swept up on the beach overnight and they're slowly dying, and the child is running from starfish to starfish and tossing them back into the ocean. Man walks down the beach and says, "What are you doing? There are too many of them. It won't make a difference." And the child responds, "Starfish in hand, for this one it will." So I firmly believe one person can make a difference. And I think you start with what you're doing here in Utah. And let me give you another example. You talk 250 million people using mobile devices to access this content. In the UK, they are automatically filtering every mobile device. Every mobile device. Something we ought to work on here. I suspect that there will be those not thrilled about that. And you want to retain choice. But that's one of the reasons why I like David Cameron's approach. You don't just depend upon educating parents and families to do the right thing as the only solution. An element of this has to be policymakers. I think your Utah leadership, you have an extraordinary leader on this issue for many years in Senator Hatch. I think we need leadership from Congress. I'd like to see legislation from Congress. The people I've met on Capitol Hill on both sides of the aisle are gun shy because of the power of the internet industry. And these are good people. These are not people who are pro-porn. They've got their own agendas, and their agenda is to protect the integrity of what they're trying to accomplish, and they want to see as free and unfettered an internet as possible. I want that too. I just think there have to be some limits. And that's why, the reason I like the Cameron approach, there's another thing that I think is important about the Cameron approach. The reason I like it is, to the best of my knowledge, there is one head of government on the planet today who's talking about this issue. It's David Cameron in the UK. We need 5 of them talking about it, or 10, or 50, or 150. So the goal is to build awareness, build concern, demonstrate at the grassroots level, like you've done in Utah, that you can produce change, you can mobilize action, you can make this happen. And I think there's a contagion that can spread. The key to this, like organizing any public policy effort, is coalition building. And that's why I'm enthusiastic about the fact that political opposites share the same interest here. You know, going to Congress when we can demonstrate that the only people concerned about this problem are not just conservative Republicans, they're liberal Democrats who are also as outraged about this. But, you know, it's hard, and I don't suggest to you that it's going to happen overnight. Yes, ma'am.
We have
I'm
a
sorry.
question right here, and then
Question. There's
Sure.
Women for Decency that you can go to, and there's other groups like Fight the New Drug that when you sign up you become aware, and then just sharing it on Facebook, that just broadens the whole talking about it. So that's all grassroots. Sad to say right
Yeah.
now.
Well, there's got to be, I mean, the point she made is a really good one. There's Women for Decency. There's Fight the New Drug. Clay Olson's here, who's done remarkable work in this space. So there is the ability to mobilize and activate a lot of people using social media and other things. My argument is it can't be all grassroots up. You know, we need to do that part to get the attention of policymakers that this is an issue, a problem that there's broad-based concern about. But some of it needs to be top down. You know, some of it needs to be driven by policymakers. So the best way, Senator Weiler mentioned to me, I keep pointing over there, it mentioned to me last night that he was called by Don Hawkins at the National Center. There he is. This is your model. Thank you. It took political courage and vision and leadership to do what he did. One of our first challenges should be to clone him. In 50 other states and the Congress of the United States, one person can make a difference. The senator made a difference.
first of all, I'm getting way too much credit. I had a lot of help, but this guy is amazing. Let me just, if I could just take 30 seconds. I've been in contact during this conference texting the lobbyist for McDonald's of Utah. I said, when Governor Herbert signs our resolution next month, I want McDonald's there standing next to me saying that they're going to make their Wi-Fi filtered for children so no child can access pornography. And on a tablet at McDonald's, I said, I want to champion McDonald's, and if we can get McDonald's on board, and I'm almost 90% confident we can then start pressuring other restaurants. Your children can take a tablet that they get at school into 30 different restaurants and every public library and access pornography. And I hope you'll start talking to your libraries and saying, why are you catering pornography to my children? You need to have filtered access.
Exactly. That's leadership.
Mr. Allen, there's a question
There was
over
a question
here.
over here. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Allen, over here. Hey.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No worries.
We'll get to you next.
So I work for an ISP, so I get to see both sides of this. I am obviously in favor of some sort of verification. I love the idea. I love the Cameron model. I think it's amazing. My biggest question is, how do you apply that to user-created content? How do you apply that to Twitter? How do you apply that to YouTube, to avenues of social media that obviously have valid uses, but there's tons of filth mixed in it? How do you do that with Instagram? How do you do it with Snapchat? How is that possible to do age verification on something that's such an open platform?
Well, the answer is there are obviously lots of challenges, and it's going to be an incremental process. One of the criticisms in the early days of the UK effort is, well, you will overblock, keep people from getting to content on a breast cancer site. So the UK has a mechanism in place that is overseeing and determining It's an agency called Ofcom, which is kind of the equivalent of the FCC in the United States. So it's helpful if there's a mechanism to do that. Obviously, my view is we need to cast the net as broadly as we can and do it in a very surgical way. So we don't want to harm Twitter or these other sites. And the technology challenges are not insubstantial. I'd like to see your company and similar companies become a part of the process. Help us define it. One of the things when we met, and incidentally, the initiative I'm chairing for Prime Minister Cameron's called We Protect, Microsoft, Google, and Facebook are serving on that board. I mean, these companies are as concerned about internet sexual exploitation as you are, as I am. The debate is on the technique. And to this point, obviously there are lots of technical hurdles that have to be overcome. The other thing that I heard from those companies, and it's a fair point, is they said to me, the United Kingdom doesn't have a First Amendment. Well, this is not China doing this. This is not Iran or North Korea. It's hard to imagine a country on the planet more like us than Great Britain. So my response is, and it's happening as a result of leadership. I firmly believe that all human progress happens as a result of leadership. David Cameron took this on, he says, and I believe him, because he didn't bring it up once in the political campaign leading up to his reelection as prime minister, and wouldn't let me talk about it to the media during that time period because he said, I don't want it to look like I'm politicizing this. So I think he did it because he's a dad. And he was concerned. He called what's happening to children from internet pornography today, in his words, corroding childhood. And I think he's exactly right. So, we'd love to work with you to look for the best path forward. And this is not just the ISPs. Obviously, the broadband type companies, the whole telecom industry is a part of this. To do age verification, it's going to have to be designed in a way that it has the broadest application without doing harm to the basic business model. I get it, understand. You've been trying to ask a question but I'll come back to you. All right, well, John, will you make a commitment that she gets to ask the next one? Okay.
So my question is the use of XXX top domain names, and if that could accomplish anything here. I want to say the last I heard was that they were available, but there's nothing regulating or mandating the use of them. Can you, just speak to that at all?
Well, I was a skeptic on the value of XXX domain names. Creating a red light district, on the internet, I think is conceptually sound. The problem is it hasn't eliminated content in other places. If you could funnel everything into XXX domain, that's a good thing. I think it's another positive effort to do something constructive, but it's not keeping kids off of these sites. So, I don't have a lucid response. I think it was a noble effort, but probably didn't get to the core of the issue of the problem. Yes, ma'am.
Get y'all excited. It's probably not a very good question, but as far as parents go with filters for their children, I've heard a lot of just kind of criticism about some of them not being being easily taken off by kind of the older children, like in their teens. So do you have like a list of certain filters or certain softwares that are harder to take off, that are a bit more protective, so that way like 15 and 16-year-olds who are very internet savvy don't, it's not as easy for them to take them off?
Well, there are some really good ones here at this event. You ought to talk to them in the exhibit area, and I'm not doing a commercial for anybody. But you're exactly right. The reality is we live in a time, first time in human history, actually. Children are supposed to learn about the central aspects of modern life from their parents. And I would argue there are others who say there have been other instances, but certainly I can't imagine one more dramatic, in which kids know far more about this technology, which has fundamentally changed everything we do and the way we do it, than do their parents. So absolutely, the 15 and 16-year-old, and increasingly the 12 and 13-year-old, may be able to defeat the filter. So challenge number one is, as Deanna said in the early one, parents need to become better informed. Parents need to stay on top of things. But that's the other reason why I'm in favor of the UK's default filtering initiative, because it's not dependent upon the actions of individual parents or an individual product. But for a long time, I think your question's incredibly relevant, and research it. You know, find the best, strongest when you can, ask questions, just like you would buy any other product. Yes, sir.
I may not need a microphone, so you tell me. When you were working with the exploitation of children or human trafficking, what sort of relationship did you see between that and pornography at the time? Because we know that's gotten a lot closer in relation.
It's a slippery slope. It's a difficult issue. There is some research that does suggest that the extensive use of pornography, particularly the escalating use, more and more extreme, more and more dramatic, at some point leads some segment of that population to child pornography. What I've said historically, and what I still kind of believe, is that we're really talking about a very different audience. And this is one of the areas where the internet has caused an explosion. I set up a CyberTipline at the National Center in 1998. For the first time in, 2014, they handled 1 million reports of sexual exploitation in a single year. That was 2014. 2015, they handled 5 million. In 2002, I set up a child victim identification program as a result of a bizarre decision by the Supreme Court that held that virtual child pornography was protected speech. In other words, if a real child isn't harmed in the production of the content, it's protected by the First Amendment. So we set up this effort because, the big challenge is, who's the child? Where's the child? How do you get help to the child? How do you identify and rescue the child? So we set up that unit, asked police and prosecutors, not just in the United States, but around the world, to send us the images so we could try to place the child somewhere on planet Earth and ultimately figure out who they were and get them help. 2003, we received 50,000 images. We were overwhelmed. Last year, the center received 25 million images. And one of the other challenges, I invited members of the Supreme Court to come over to the center and talk to them after that case. Didn't lobby them on the case, didn't do anything unethical, just wanted them to understand the problem. And one of the points that came up was, well, aren't these really just 20-year-olds dressed up in pigtails and made to look like they're 15? My response to that was, not exactly. Of the now 125 million images that the center has reviewed, and of the thousands of children who have been identified, 76% of them are prepubescent. 10% are infants and toddlers. And there's growing demand for younger and younger children. I've sat in on sex offender treatment groups, and the sex offenders say one of the reasons there's such interest in the youngest children is that they are, quote, pre-verbal. They can't tell anybody what happened to them. They can't tell anybody who did it to them. So this is a massive problem that is evolving with the emergence of the dark web and internet anonymity. And the other thing, I know I'm abusing the time, Jim, but let me finish one other thought. The other thing was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, someone who had sexual interest in a prepubescent child felt isolated, alone, aberrant. Today, they're part of a global community. They're communicating with people of like interest around the world. And let me give you one horrific example to prepare you for lunch on a positive note. Queensland, Australia police recently made an arrest in which parents had adopted a newborn and began sexually abusing and photographing the newborn from birth. Then they created an encrypted network worldwide to share the images of the child's abuse with people on this encrypted network, and they even traveled with the little boy so that members of the network could not only look at the pictures, but could abuse him themselves. And they got caught because one of the members of the network made a mistake and connected from a Tor IP to a non-Tor IP and left a trail, which enabled Australian authorities to penetrate the network and shut it down. The FBI just used hacking techniques on a site called Playpen. And you can imagine the content on Playpen. Playpen had 225,000 users. The FBI got a search warrant to target one user who they'd been able to identify, penetrated the site, installed malware on the site, which then spread throughout the user population so that they could identify thousands of them. And that case is under appeal in the federal courts. The argument is, even though they had probable cause and got a warrant, the warrant is an individual warrant, not a general warrant, which is constitutionally precluded. The court so far, 2 intermediate circuit courts, have said they had plenty of probable cause and they handled it responsibly. So this is a huge problem. I know I've wandered off from your original question, but the question is there a linkage? Yes. How strong a linkage, I'm not sure yet. And a lot of it is because the demand for child pornography is primarily among the population of pedophiles. And one final thought on that. My friend Dr. Cito in Canada estimates that 1%, at least 1% of the male population is pedophile, is exclusively pedophile. There are 3.5 billion males on the planet today. 1% is 35 million people. So this is not just a problem of the village pervert. There are a lot of people. So the work I've done with the Catholic Church, one of the arguments I've made is that, yeah, this is a serious problem the church needs to deal with, needs to address, act serious about, act like they care for the victims. But this is a far larger problem than the Catholic Church. I think I've droned on long enough. Thank you very much.
It's a true civic hero.